Welcome, everybody, to the 83rd episode of the Jewish Drinking Show. I'm your host, Rabbi Drew Kaplan. I'm very excited to welcome first-time guest, Professor David.
I'm going to guess it's Freidenreich?
Freidenreich.
Freidenreich. Okay, I was pretty close.
Close. Common mistake.
There we go, Freidenreich. So Professor Freidenreich here, for at least those less familiar with him, he is the Pulver Family Professor of Jewish Studies at Colby College, where he serves as Director of the Jewish Studies Program and Associate Director of the Center for Small Town Jewish Life. After receiving a BA from Brandeis University, he earned his Ph.D. at Columbia University and rabbinic ordination from the Jewish Theological Seminary. His award-winning first book, Foreigners and Their Food, Constructing Otherness in Jewish, Christian, and Islamic Law, explores attitudes towards adherents of foreign religions expressed in ancient and medieval laws about sharing food. In this book, the Foreigners and Their Food book, Professor Freidenreich wrote about, amongst other topics, medieval rabbinic authorities reconceiving of the limits of Gentile wine. And for those looking for some background on this topic, you are welcome to check out episode 71 of the Jewish Drinking Show, Gentile Libation Wine in the Mishnah and Talmud, featuring Professor Avram Shannon. So, you know what? Before we get into this topic, Professor Freidenreich, how did you decide to research this topic?
Of all things, I fell into this topic by studying medieval canon law. I've studied Talmud from elementary school on, but got really fascinated by Christian and Islamic parallels. And in taking a graduate level seminar course on canon law, I stumbled across rules about how Christians shouldn't eat with Jews. Like, wait a minute, since when do Christians have rules about food to begin with? Like, Jews have rules about food, Muslims have rules, but Christians, they don't have rules about food. Yes, they do. And they have tons of rules about not eating with Jews. And even not eating with Muslims, because Muslims are kind of Jewish, because after all, Muslims have these crazy rules about food as well. And, I was fascinated by this material, creating an article for some arcane canon law journal. And my advisor said, this is really good stuff. If there are any Jewish or Islamic parallels to rules about not eating with other people, you have a dissertation. And I laughed because, of course, there are parallels about eating or not eating with non-Jews and even some with non-Muslims. And then I paused and said, wait a minute, this isn't just a dissertation. This is my life. At the time I was living at a Christian seminary, I was reading his comments sitting at my table where I often had Christian friends over for Shabbos dinner. Like, we eat together, but why don't ancient and medieval scholars want us eating together? What are they worried about? And so the issue about wine relates directly to concerns about what kind of interaction is okay? What do we need to be worried about? And what does it say about us that we need to be worried about them in this particular way? And Jews, Christians, and Muslims have totally different answers to that question.
With that as sort of laying the groundwork. So speaking of laying the groundwork, okay, so that's cool. That's a great origin story for how you got into it and ultimately compose your dissertation on this, right? And so the book is Foreigners and Their Food is basically your dissertation worked into
exactly. It's the revised version of the dissertation. And my advice to anybody, trying to pursue a dissertation, the cocktail party test. Can you tell somebody what you're planning on writing about, and they actually ask for more information rather than moving on to talk to somebody else? And this passed the cocktail party test far better than any of the other ideas I had in mind.
Well, that's wonderful. That sounds
Once again, back to the drinking.
Right. Exactly. Full circle. Okay. So with that, before we get to the actual topic, it sounds like we also need to lay some groundwork, some framework for understanding the medieval context of this conversation. So yes, there was an earlier episode talking about the Mishnah and Talmud, sort of these foundational rabbinic texts, talking about Yei Nesech, sort of the problematics involving Gentile libation wine. So do you mind sharing with us sort of some Mishnaic, some early, Talmudic, early rabbinic approaches towards? It sounds like we're also dealing with two different topics. We're playing with both Yei Nesech and Stamina, that we're dealing with both Gentile libation wine and just sort of their wine that has nothing to do with libation. So there are various problems involved, right?
to back up even before the Mishnah, if you look at the Torah, you're not going to find anything about the wine of non-Israelites. It's just not an issue. It starts to become an issue late in biblical times. You've got, somebody like Daniel who refuses to accept the food and the wine provided by the Babylonian king. He'll take, water and vegetables, natural foods, not processed foods. And there are even, stories about Queen Esther, of all people, Queen Esther, refusing to drink the wine of non-Jews. That was a rewrite of the biblical book of Esther, where the drinking is absolutely central to the plot. But that bothered people during later periods. And the rabbis inherited these concerns, these social anxieties about interacting too closely with their Greco-Roman neighbors. And as Professor Shannon laid out beautifully, Greco-Roman neighbors spent a lot of time offering wine in libation. And so the rabbis were concerned not only about, what happens if I buy fish paste from my non-Jewish neighbor. How do I know they only use kosher fish in making their fish paste? Because I can't tell what the ingredients are in this bottle. Okay, that's one kind of concern. Wine libation was a different kind of concern. How do I know whether this wine was offered in libation? I can't see, there's no trace there. And the rabbis expressed the fear that non-Jews offered wine in libation at every available opportunity.
What about so that's sort of Greco-Roman. What about as the Jews, certainly the Babylonian Talmud switches scenery to Sasanian Persia. So they're not so much surrounded in the Greco-Roman cultural milieu. They're more, they have Zoroastrians going on.
In Babylonia, you've got Zoroastrians, you've got Christians. You do not have Greco-Roman anything. Nobody is offering libations on a regular basis in Sasanian Babylonia. But you'd never know that from reading the Gemara, because the Gemara is interested in figuring out the legal implications of the Mishnah. If our sages said this, well, how do we apply it to these cases? So you get a case in the Gemara, for example, of a non-Jew climbing a palm tree, right? He wants to grab a palm frond. And on his way down, he slips, and the end of the palm frond ends up in the Jew's wine barrel. Do we need to worry when he shakes off the palm frond that some of that wine has been offered in libation? This has nothing to do with what the Gentile himself thinks about the action. It has to do with how the rabbis are applying the rules of the Mishnah to the probably hypothetical scenario that they are addressing. What's fascinating about the Gemara's treatments of Yenesech is that it's completely divorced from social reality. It's all about this kind of scholastic process of understanding and amplifying and clarifying the rules of the game, because after all, it's the rules that matter. We don't really care about Gentiles. We don't even really care about wine. We care about halakha, because halakha is what God wants us not just to do, but to study. The very act of studying it is what makes us who we are. And so they study it without too much regard for the practical ramifications.
Okay. All right, so that's a sense into an insight into the Talmudic perspective you're saying on both Yenesech and Stam Yinam.
Yes, and it is in this period that you get the distinction between, right? Is there even Yenesech versus Stam Yinam? To what degree can we assume that Gentiles aren't offering wine in libation? Or to what degree do we imagine the moment we turn our eyes, they're doing it, the moment it's left alone with them? Of course, keep in mind as well that Sasanian Babylonia was a beer drinking culture, not a wine drinking culture.
Right.
A lot of this is in the realm of the hypothetical. It becomes much more practical in the time of the Rishonim, both as wine consumption becomes more widespread through the Middle East. So the Gaonim are actually dealing with wine issues, in part because they're corresponding more broadly. And especially once Gaonic responsa find their way into Europe, North Africa, places that are really wine cultures rather than beer cultures.
Okay, so now that we're progressing forward in time, we're going to the Gaonic period. So I did, by the way, I did like what you said about Sasanian Persia being more of a beer drinking culture than necessarily wine, which might have also deflected some of the attention. There might not have been as much attention onto the wine because it wasn't as serious of a border to police, I guess, as far as, right, for cultures.
Look, you could do a page analysis to see whether the rabbis devote less attention to the Yein Nesech parts of Avodah Zarah than the other parts. I think they spent just about as much time on everything because, Torah v'lilmod ani tzarich. This is Torah. I need to be learning it, and so they learned it. They studied it. They kept on applying it, but they applied it in ways that weren't necessarily oriented toward the realities of their day, because they didn't need to give precise instructions that people were going to be paying attention to. And okay, wait a minute, this is going to really shape my livelihood. This is really going to shape my daily activities. In a world when people drank alcohol on a daily basis. Like, this stuff has the potential to transform Jewish life. In the Bavli, it's not yet there. It becomes so much more during the period of the Rishonim.
Okay. All right. So moving forward to the Gaonim. So that's post-Talmudic. So we're talking, what, 8th, 9th, 10th centuries, roughly?
Yep.
Give or take. Okay. So they're largely situated, similar geographical area, Babylonia. What goes on? How do they transform? How do they take these sort of Talmudic precedents, and how do they start transforming and shaping the rules around both of these different types of wine, both the Yein Nesech and the Stam Yino?
Great. So the Mishnah is kind of a law school text. It's not about give me practical answers. It's give me stuff I can study to learn how to think like a rabbi. And the Talmud is all about expounding that, thinking like a rabbi. It's as if you were in the law school classroom studying this stuff. Gaonic responsa are cut to the chase. What's the actual applied rule? Somebody has asked a question. Let me give you an answer. And people started to ask the question, wait a minute, my Muslim neighbors are not offering wine in libation. Do I have to follow all these rules? Do they still apply to me in a Muslim context? And the early Gaonim said, yeah, they do, because Muslims are still idolaters. They may not realize that they're idolaters. They may claim to worship one God, but they're still idolaters. Later Gaonim take a somewhat different answer. And they say, well, Muslims are idolaters, but they don't offer wine libations. We know that Muslims are officially opposed to alcohol. We know they drink it anyway, but they're certainly not drinking it in their mosques. They're certainly not worshiping their God with alcohol. And so the Gaonim come up with an analogy. Well, the Bavli says...
By the way, are there particular Gaonim that are doing this articulation?
A variety of Gaonim say this. One of the most important texts is actually attributed to several different Gaonim, which is to say that it kept on circulating and nobody in the Middle Ages knew exactly who it was, so they attributed different names to it. One of the most significant Gaonim to kind of bring it all together is Hai or Haya Gaon. And he makes the argument that Muslims are analogous to the Talmudic case of a newborn idolater, right? Imagine a baby who touches wine. The baby's not intending to offer a libation to Zeus. Similarly, the Muslims not intending to offer a libation to God, right? That's not what they have in mind. And because we have a Talmudic precedent, Rav says that it's okay when a baby touches wine You can sell it to a non-Jew. You can derive benefit from it. You still can't drink it because we're still not entirely certain, right? That's stam yenam. But it's not yein nesech. We can benefit from it. So if a Muslim touches your wine, you can sell it to a Muslim. Because again, we know the Muslims are drinking it, but we also know that they're not worshiping with it. Christians, Hagaon says, they're a different story. We know they use wine in their worship. They do. The Eucharist involves wine.
Yeah.
And so as far as Hagaon is concerned, Christians are out of bounds because they use wine in their libations in their worship. Muslims are okay. Right? This is the first time, in fact, in rabbinic literature that you have a distinction, a practical distinction, between different kinds of non-Jews. Rabbinic literature is about there are Jews and there are Goyim. It's a 1-0 binary. There's this hypothetical case of the resident alien, but it's a total hypothetical, and the Talmud makes clear there are no real resident aliens. We've got
also resident aliens have nothing to do with wine. Right?
No, there are actually Talmudic statements about the wine of a resident alien. Is that permitted for contact or not? The answer is you cannot drink the wine of a resident alien, but you can sell it for benefit. That is not what the Gaonim are going with. They're going with the newborn analogy, because as far as they're concerned, Muslims are idolaters without realizing it. Because after all, if we have a 1-0 world, where you're either Jewish and believe in God, or you're not Jewish and don't believe in God. Well, Muslims aren't Jewish, so they must not believe in God.
Okay, so
or
the
if they
Gaonim
believe
say
in God, they don't get it right.
Right. So basically, I was going to say, so basically, the Gaonim are saying, yeah, the Christians and their wine, that's libation wine, but the Muslims, that's more just sort of general wine. There's no way that could even come into the possibility of libation, so we can benefit from it even if we can't drink it. Right.
Exactly. Right. So we're going to keep up that barrier of stam yenam because it's tradition, but we don't have to be worried about yein nesech because Muslims don't offer libations.
Right. Our Gentiles are okay. The wine of our Gentiles is okay, but the Gentiles over there in Europe, that's really problematic.
Well, look, I mean, there are plenty of Christians still living in Babylonia. So they are concerned about their own neighbors in a hypothetical sense. They certainly know more about Eastern Christianity than European Christianity. But the other key piece here is that the Gaonim, I think, have internalized a really important aspect of Islamic thought, because Muslims are the ones who distinguish, right? There's 1 Muslims, there are 0 pagans, but then there are these people that are like 0.3 or 0.5, namely Jews and Christians, who are sort of like us. Right? They also worship one God, although the Christians kind of in a weird way. They also accept authoritative scriptures, the Torah and the Gospels. Those are real as far as Muslims are concerned. They got superseded by the Quran. The Jews and Christians are behind the times. They're not equal to us, but they're not at the bottom of the scale. They're somewhere in the middle. And the Gaonim also create a space in the middle for Muslims. They say Muslims and Christians are different. They take for granted that the distinctions among non-Jews are legally relevant. The rabbis of the Mishnah and the Talmud wouldn't have crossed their minds to make a distinction between pagans, Zoroastrians, Christians. They didn't bother, certainly not with respect to yein nesech.
I hope you've been enjoying this episode so far on medieval halacha and Gentile wine. If you're interested in more on halacha and Gentile wine, you should stay tuned for next week's episode featuring Professor Mark Shapiro on an interesting issue of censorship involving Gentile wine. Here's a sneak peek.
It says practical implications. So much so that when the responsum after it was censored, later rabbis didn't even realize they saw references to this responsum. They thought that it couldn't be authentic. It must have been put in by various characters.
Hope you enjoyed that sneak peek into next week's episode featuring Professor Shapiro. Now back into this episode.
So then sort of taking that up a little bit, at least vis-a-vis Muslims and thinking about Muslims within this, I don't know, these constrictions with regards to wine comes along Maimonides, right?
Yeah, Maimonides takes us in a very different direction, in part because he grows up in a different kind of Islamic world.
Okay.
Maimonides grew up in Spain, in a portion of Spain that was ruled by the Almohads. The word literally means al-muwahidun, those who unify God's name.
Like
The Almohads insisted that there is only one God, that it is logically demonstrable that there's only one God, and therefore they required everybody in their rule to affirm the one God, namely the Muslim God, Allah. And in fact, there's some circumstantial evidence that Maimonides himself nominally became a Muslim for some period of time, because that's what the government required. And we know that he wrote, look, if the government's going to require you to make some confession that declares that God is one, go ahead and do it. There's nothing non-Jewish about what they're saying about God. And when Maimonides turns in the Mishnah Torah to the question of Yenesech, he says, look, Muslims are resident aliens. They are monotheists. Unlike the Gaonim, who say they're idolaters, they don't offer wine libations. He says they're not idolaters at all. And if they're not idolaters at all, then their wine can't be prohibited for benefit. We still can't drink it. Right? He's increasingly worried about the possibility of social interactions between Jews and Muslims. But Yein Nesech doesn't apply to Muslims. As far as Maimonides is concerned, it absolutely applies to Christians, because Trinitarian theology is polytheism, as far as Maimonides is concerned, as far as the Almohads are concerned.
It's a non-unification of the name.
It is.
Yeah.
Now, of course, Christians would give you a different argument for it. That's
Right.
a different story. But what Maimonides is doing that the Gaonim didn't is dividing up those non-Jews on the basis of theology rather than the basis of ritual practice. And he's saying that Muslims are superior to other non-Jews. In fact, they're almost like us to the extent that they worship God alone. And this symbolic relaxation of the rules about Yein Nesech for Muslims is a way to exemplify that distinction that for Maimonides really mattered, because he's a theologian. He cares about these ideas deeply. And many much more practically minded readers, and especially readers in the Christian world, saw his text in a totally different way.
Well, also Maimonides tends to be very thought-oriented, like distinctly thought-oriented.
Absolutely.
And beliefs.
The very fact that the Mishnah Torah begins with, here are the things you need to believe. Professor Sarah Strumsa has made the case that Maimonides is an Almohad Jew. He's totally internalized the culture he grew up in, where you have to accept certain doctrinal statements. You know, the very notion of these 13 things that Jews must believe to be good Jews, that doesn't exist in rabbinic literature.
Right.
The rabbinic texts he's drawing on say, you can't do X, you can't do Y. Maimonides says, you must believe 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 13. He's living in a different world, and he's internalizing aspects of that world to express what it means to be Jewish. And as a result, his version of Jewishness is different from that of Jews who lived in different times and places.
Wow. Okay, so he's very belief-driven, right? Very belief-driven, and that affects the way he perceives Muslims, since they're unifiers of the name. They believe in one God. There's no way they can even think about sacrificing to another God, or more pertinent to our considerations, libations, let alone, and working off the Gaonic piece about they don't even drink wine. How could they much less incorporate that into their offerings to God? So they don't even, but you could still benefit from their wine even if you can't drink it.
Correct. Although I will say that Maimonides carefully misreads the Gaonim. He wants you to think, when you read the Mishnah Torah, that he's not doing anything new. He wants you to think that what he's saying is in the Gemara, because the Gemara talks about resident aliens, and was affirmed by the Gaonim. Even though the Gaonim didn't refer to resident aliens, the Gaonim referred to newborns. The newborn piece doesn't appear in Maimonides because for Maimonides, it's not that the Muslims are ignorant. It's not that they're uneducated. They are intentionally monotheistic. So he spins it differently, but he keeps on grounding it in those sources so that if you don't look really carefully, you miss what he's doing. You think that this is Torah Moshe Sinai, which is what the rabbis are always about. We want to demonstrate that we're not doing anything new, even if historically we can see that there are new things happening in response to new concerns.
Right.
This is
well, I mean, he's also,
part of Torah.
I mean, also, this is going far afield, but he's also dealing with the Karaite problem. So he definitely has to ground this in tradition, for sure. He basically moves the Muslims out of the Yain Nesach category, the Gentile libation wine. It's still Stam Yinam, while the Christians, because they're not in his orientation, his belief structure, monotheists, they do, and they still have their libations as part of the Eucharist. So they very much are, their wine is deeply problematic as far as Yain Nesach.
As far as Maimonides is concerned.
As far as he is concerned. Correct. Okay.
Hello, dear listeners. It's your host, Rabbi Drew. I wanted to break in right now and just say, hey, thank you so much for listening. I really appreciate, or watching, however you're consuming this content. And I'm always open for new ideas, both for specifically the Jewish Drinking Show, whether it's topics, whether it's guests. I'm also looking for other resources that I can provide you with in the Jewish Drinking Project more broadly. Also, I'd really like to offer you the opportunity to sponsor this work. Whether if you want to go to patreon.com/Jewish Drinking, I would greatly appreciate it. And if you have ideas for swag, also, please feel free to send them to me at drew@jewishdrinking.com. All right, thank you so much, L'chaim, and now back into the episode.
Okay, that's really interesting, Professor Freidenreich, as far as Rambam, Maimonides, and his orientation and sort of restructuring and sort of moving around the Muslims within his structure with regards to wine. Now, what was going on in the European theater for the Ashkenazi? What was going on over there?
So at the same time that Maimonides is writing in Egypt, you've got the Tosafists active in France. Right? Remember, Rashi writes in Champagne. It's a wine region, past and present.
Yeah.
His sons, grandsons, great-grandsons, they are all involved in wine. Everybody in that region consumes wine, and Jews played an active role in producing it, in selling it, in marketing it. This was just a major part of the local economy. And at the same time, these, Rashi and the Tosafists don't know Maimonides yet, but they do know the Gaonic Responsa. And they've got these precedents that suggest, wait a minute, maybe we don't need to apply Talmudic statements about Yain Nesach quite so stringently. And it would make life a lot easier if we didn't.
Since there's wine everywhere.
There's wine everywhere. And in fact, there's an argument to be made that none of the rules apply. Remember that the Gaonim said people who don't offer wine libations are like newborns. And as Rav said in the Bavli, Jewish wine touched by a newborn idolater, you're welcome to sell for benefit. Shmuel said, Jewish wine touched by a non-Jewish infant, you can drink. It's not even Stam Yinam.
Oh, wow.
There were some Ashkenazic authorities who applied the logic of Shmuel in certain contexts. And so if you take those two pieces and combine them together, when you know that your Christian neighbors don't randomly offer wine and libation, Jews living in Christian Europe knew full well, yes, there's wine libation going on in church, but only the priests are doing it, and they're only doing it at certain times. And in the Middle Ages, only the priests drank that wine. There's no way that Jews would accidentally find themselves in the possession of wine that had been sanctified for the Eucharist.
Wow.
They could have gotten rid of these rules entirely. They didn't. They bent over backwards to keep the rules in place. And so one way they did that was by disproving the Gaonic analogy between adult Muslims and infant newborns. The Rabbi Yitzchak of Dampierre said, wait a minute, you got the wrong analogy here. When newborns touch wine, they don't even know what they're doing. They don't think they're touching wine. They're just kind of, moving their hands around. Whereas when adults touch wine, they know exactly what they're doing. They act with intention, even if the intention isn't idolatrous. The analogy doesn't work because they're acting intentionally, therefore they're going wrong. But the Rashbam makes a broader case. He says, look, this has never really been about libation. Because even in Greco-Roman times, Rashbam says, and he might be right. Really? You think that non-Jews would be turning around and offering libations at a moment's notice when you turn your back? No, that's not what they're talking about at all. What are the rabbis really worried about? They're worried about social interaction that's going to lead to intermarriage. That's going to lead to sex between Jews and non-Jews. And because the concern really is about social interaction, we cannot consume wine with non-Jews. Because if we consume wine with non-Jews, we might find ourselves, getting into undue intimate relationships with them.
That happens with wine.
In the Middle Ages, many Jewish households had Christian women working as domestic servants. And the biggest concern with regard to Gentile contact with Jewish wine was precisely, what if you ask your servant to pour you a glass of wine? That's the moment at which the danger occurs. And so Jewish households, rabbinic households at least, bent over backwards to keep their domestic servants away from the wine supply to make sure that they could continue to drink their wine. This is a practical distinction that reminds everybody in the relationship at every meal, we're Jewish, you're not Jewish, we've got to keep a separation. And so for Rashbam, this is a real concern in a way that it wasn't for the Mishnah.
Rashbam, I should note for listeners, is one of the grandsons of Rashi.
Exactly.
Ri was also, right? Rabbi Yitzchak of Dampierre?
Rabbi Yitzchak of Dampierre, if I'm not mistaken, was a great-grandson.
Okay.
But they're all extended family. And these are, the most prominent halachic authorities of that area of Ashkenaz in the 12th century. And their ideas about Yein Nesach became so widespread that even in Italy, you've got the Rid, Yeshayahu Detrani, if I'm not mistaken, who comes up with a perfectly logical reason as to why none of these rules about wine should apply. But he says, don't listen to me. Don't actually apply what I said.
He's saying that for both Yein Nesach and Stam Yinam, or just the Yein Nesach?
He actually says the whole thing is legally meaningless.
Including Stam Yinam?
What Yeshayahu Detrani says is that, in fact, the analogy with the newborn is accurate. Neither the newborn nor Christian has any intention of offering wine in libation. And if they have no intention of offering wine in libation, Rav says it's permitted for benefit. Shmuel says it's permitted for consumption. And the Rid followed Shmuel in other respects. And so he said, look, in theory, you could argue that none of these rules apply anymore, but don't listen to me.
I mean,
because we have it established on the authority of the Tosafists that this is not the proper way to interpret the texts, which is to say that Ashkenazic rabbis understood what they were doing. They had an option to relax the rules. By the way, in the 20th century, conservative rabbis did exactly what Yeshayahu Detrani said, and they applied it. They said, you don't need to follow these rules anymore because they're not relevant in the 20th century.
Right.
In the Middle Ages,
which, by the way, would make a really interesting future episode. I'm just putting it out there.
Absolutely. There's plenty to discuss about that one.
All right, but sticking in the medieval era, I mean, what's fascinating for me to hear that about this Italian rabbi is that makes sense insofar as the Yein Nesach issue, but you still have the intermarriage issue.
But remember, the intermarriage issue is not in the Mishnah. It's not even really in the Gemara. There's one passage in the Gemara.
There is a passage because they're daughters.
It's in the wrong place. It's not actually in Hilchot Yein Nesach. It's earlier in Avodah Zarah.
Right.
There are some
But that's
textual
also
reasons.
boundaries. That's also boundaries, right?
Yep. No, look, they can be connected.
Mm-hmm.
And Rambam will restrict wine out of concern for marriage and the like, the same way he will restrict other access to food, not about are the ingredients kosher, the major concern of the Mishnah, but what does this mean for social interaction? And at the end of the day, what the Ashkenazic rabbis were worried about was social interaction and about maintaining the distinction, reminding Jews on a daily basis, every time they went to get their wine, whoa, I'm Jewish, she's not. That emphasis on us as opposed to them is so important to the Rishonim that they're willing to impose upon themselves and their communities serious economic, social, logistical obstacles in order to preserve their own distinctive identity as a minority within a Christian society.
But they still wouldn't necessarily drink the Christian wine, right? It's more
not.
It became more of an issue, like you mentioned, with the Gentile servants, right? Or the I guess the maids.
Well, what they preserved is the entire set. Ashkenazic Jews would not drink either wine made by Christians or Jewish wine touched by Christians.
Okay.
All of the rules that we know today about keeping wine distinct, making sure that we've got wine that is mevushal because the ancient gods didn't drink boiled wine. It didn't taste good and everybody knew it. It was inferior wine, right? The concerns about who's allowed to open and pour a bottle of wine, all of those rules come straight out of the Mishnah through the Talmud, reaffirmed by the Rishonim. And what the Rishonim do is say it doesn't matter whether our neighbors are idolaters or not idolaters. What matters is they're not us. They're not Jews. And because they're not Jews, we need to keep ourselves separate with regard to wine. Other things as well, but wine, because it had been the central focus of the Mishnah and the Tannaitic rabbis, it remained the central focus for the Rishonim as well.
So let me pull back a little, ask a broader question now that you raised that. How significant, I imagine food to some degree played a role as far as, I would say, whether you want to call it establishing or even maintaining these boundaries between Jews and Gentiles, at least for the Franco-German Jewry at the time. How important was that? I mean, you did mention this is a very, wine plays a daily role in people's lives at that time there. So was that a really important barrier to maintain, or one of the most significant barriers even?
So we don't know enough about social interaction among everyday Jews and Christians in that time.
Okay.
What we do know is that the Tosafists had the opportunity to get rid of these rules, and they instead doubled down. We know that they did so even though Christians deeply resented these rules. We also know that Jews continued to employ Christian servants, even though Christians deeply resented the notion of Christians being subservient to Jews. It was illegal for Christians to work in a Jewish household. But they did it anyway, right? It's quite possible that there were plenty of Jews who drank Christian wine, who drank with Christians. It was illegal, but people did it anyway.
Right.
And the rabbis had even less enforcement mechanisms than the church did. So what was happening on the ground is not clear at all. What the rabbis wanted to happen and why they felt it to be so important and why they wanted, the later generations, they wanted us to know what these rules are, that we can figure out from what they say, how they say it, how they choose to reread, selectively misread earlier texts to reinforce what matters to them. And what matters to the Rishonim when it comes to wine is the fact that Jews and non-Jews are not the same, and we need to keep those distinctions very clear in our minds.
Okay, great.
Rashba, Shlomo ibn Adret, comes from Ashkenaz. He settles in Christian Spain. He's familiar with the Mishnah Torah, but he's writing in a Christian environment. He doesn't understand where Maimonides is coming from, or if he does understand it, chooses not to follow it. Remember, Rambam is really interested in the theological distinctions between Muslims and Christians. Rashba couldn't care less, right? Not only does he live in a Christian world, not a Muslim world, but he also lives in a world where the logic behind Yein Nesech and Stam Yeinam has been redefined in terms of social interaction rather than theology. He chooses to portray Maimonides as if Maimonides is speaking of Gentiles who don't worship idols, but they're still kind of idolatrous. It makes no distinction. He doesn't distinguish between Muslims and Christians. They're all the same. Muslims and Christians alike, even though they don't worship idols, we're still forbidden from consuming their wine or deriving benefit from their wine. We still have to take precautions if they come into contact with our wine. We can sell it for benefit, but we can't drink it.
It's working off the Stam Yeinam model. All their wine is Stam Yeinam. It's just their wine, and none of it falls into that Yein Nesech, that Gentile libation wine category, right?
Correct.
Yes.
Which still has a lot of the rules about what you can and can't do, and certainly you can't drink it. And the Rashba is significant to our story because he became the authority within the Ashkenazi world on matters related to food and matters related to Avodah Zarah. So when Yosef Karo is putting together the Shulchan Aruch and he's paying attention to both Ashkenazi and Sephardi sources, he draws heavily on the Rashba for this material. But he changes the language slightly. And he talks about idolaters who don't worship idolatry. What? Who are idolaters who don't worship idolatry? It makes no sense. Except what Yosef Karo is doing is he's going back to the very Mishnaic logic of all of this. That if you're not Jewish, you're an idolater. Christians and Muslims are idolaters. They're idolaters who don't worship idols.
Is it the logic or is it more the language?
It's certainly the language. It's not the logic in the sense of we have idolaters who don't worship idols in a way that we didn't have that in the time of the Mishnah. But we still have the notion, or we are now fully back to the notion, that the distinction between Christians and Muslims is irrelevant. The distinction between Christians and Muslims on the one hand and Greco-Roman pagans on the other is irrelevant. Whether they worship idols or don't worship idols, they're idolaters. At the end of the day, what remains constant across this whole evolution is the worldview that says there are Jews and there are Gentiles. It's a 1-0 binary, and the distinctions among Gentiles don't matter in the time of the Talmud, and as far as Yosef Karo is concerned, they don't matter in the 16th century either. Right? And this is not the way that Christians would have seen the world. It's not the way that Muslims would have seen the world. It's a distinctly Jewish way of constructing a binary identity. And in some ways, it reflects the fact that Jews are a minority and that Jews are choosing to focus internally. We don't care about the outside world. We don't care about the dominant culture. We don't care about the fact that they're dominant. What really matters, what God really cares about, is us and is halakha. And so we're going to focus our attention inward. We're going to focus our attention on these rules. And by interpreting these rules, by applying these rules, by living these rules in our lives and in the way that we drink, we reaffirm who we are and why we need to keep ourselves distinct from, and to a certain degree separate from, our non-Jewish neighbors.
That's really incredible. I mean, it is, I mean, for me, obviously, I'm coming from, a Jewish drinking centric perspective, as it were. And so it's fascinating that really serves as an important boundary marker, for Jewish identity, certainly vis-a-vis sort of broader cultures.
Absolutely.
It's not some minor aspect of life. It actually provides something significant in Jewish identity in life.
Yes, you can learn core aspects of Jewishness by looking specifically at concerns about drinking.
This is fantastic, Professor Freidenreich. Is there anything you want to promote aside from your book that listeners are very welcome to check out to learn a little bit more. Again, that book is Foreigners and Their Food, Constructing Otherness in Jewish, Christian, and Islamic Law. Do you have anything else in the works, other books, anything you want to promote?
Sure. So the next book I'm working on is about the ways that Christians used ideas about Jews to think about Muslims. That book won't be out for another year or so. Call it summer of 22. The working title is Jewish Muslims, but keep an eye out for it. And in the meantime, if you want to see some more of the, detailed studies that I did around food, or work on small town Jewish life, or any other number of subjects that I've explored over the years, my website is web.colby.edu/dfreiden, DFREIDEN. Check it out.
Wonderful. I'll make sure to include that in the show notes. So, and by the way, I have to ask, in your Jewish Muslims book, do you have anything about wine in there?
No, I do not.
Okay. Is it because Muslims aren't really drinkers or are not supposed to be drinking?
It's because Christians aren't worried about drinking with Muslims.
So that's more of a distinctly Jewish concern vis-a-vis others.
Yes. So interestingly enough, even within Foreigners and Their Food, I don't really talk very much about Christian attitudes toward Jewish wine. Don't talk at all about Muslim attitudes toward Jewish wine. This is the boundary marker that Jews use because of the Greco-Roman context. Other traditions use other foods as their primary markers of identity and distinctiveness.
Oh, wow. All right. Okay. Well, this has been really fascinating and certainly insightful, Professor Freidenreich. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. It's been a lot of fun.
My pleasure. And l'chaim.
L'chaim.
Okay.